If we can alternate the modes of action, even better, in terms of that if you are using 2 applications, not to be using the same product or the same modes of action, I should emphasise, every time. And equally, not to forget that, okay, although chocolate spot is an issue, equally in certain seasons, rust may also be a bigger issue. And the fungicides that we are applying, those QOIs, STHIs, will be effective against rust.
Research is critical in informing best practice and guiding how farmers must adapt as the farming environment continues to change. Repeating the same farming practice year after year allows pests, weeds and disease the opportunity to overcome control measures and become established problems. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave us a review on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. In this episode, the second in a series from the recently held National Tillage Conference, we bring you a short updates from Jack Perry on aphids, Sinéad Dermody on rye for higher value markets, and Stephen Kildea on the recent changes in chocolate spot in beans. We'll first begin with Jack Perry, who's looking at how effectively aphids transmit BYDV to tolerant barley varieties.
I'm sure most of you will be aware here that BYDV is transmitted into barley by aphids feeding on the crop. What you might not be aware of is that BYDV is not one species of virus, it's a complex of different virus species. Now, in Ireland, we have 3 species of BYDV, BYDV MAV, MAV, BYDV PAV, PAV, and BYDV PAS, PAS. So I went around Ireland the last 2 years, sampling winter barley fields, and we found that the predominant species of BYDV in Ireland is BYDV MAV. That is interesting, because in mainland Europe, their main species of BYDV is BYDV PAV. This puts Ireland in a different BYDV environment than mainland Europe. Particularly interesting when it comes to looking at new tolerant cultivars of winter barley. So I'm sure you're all aware there's some really promising tolerant cultivars coming into the market. In fact, on the recommended list by DAFAM, 4 of the cultivars have some sort of tolerance gene. 2 of them have an RAD2 gene, and 2 of them have an additional RAD3 gene as well as the RAD2 gene. Now, so far, these varieties, these genes have been very well studied against BYDV PAV, that's the main one in Europe, but they've been understudied toward BYDV MAV. So I wanted to address these and make sure they're suitable in BYDV MAV environments such as Ireland. The first thing I wanted to ask was, can aphids transmit BYDV to tolerant cultivars? So what I did was I conducted a large lab experiment looking at aphid transmission of BYDV. So you can see here I tested 5 different cultivars of barley, 1 susceptible, 2 carrying the RAD2 gene, and 2 carrying the RAD2 plus 3 gene. And on the y-axis, the transmission score, a 0 on this scale would mean the aphid can't give the virus to the plant. So it's kind of the key thing from this, first aphid is the rose grain aphid. And you see here that the susceptible variety has the highest transmission score, and transmission therefore is reduced in all 4 tolerant cultivars. And we look at the next aphid, which is your bird cherry oat aphid, and we see the same pattern emerging. Transmission is highest in the susceptible cultivar and reduced in all 4 tolerant cultivars. And the last aphid we looked at was the grain aphid, which is actually the most important, we believe, BYDV vector of BYDV in Ireland. And you see here, we see the same pattern again, highest transmission in susceptible, and it's reduced in all 4 tolerant cultivars. Particularly interesting towards an ice climate is that we see the largest reduction we see is in the response to grain aphid and BYDV MAV is in the 2 RAD2 cultivars. So this sort of shows a trend that these cultivars of winter barley do reduce aphid ability to transmit BYDV. But then what does it look like at a field scale in terms of BYDV symptoms? So I conducted a plot trial in Oak Park for the last 2 years. It's all September when the barley planted. I'm looking at the average of the harvest between 2024 and 2025. So we had 2 susceptible cultivars in the trial. And you see here that kind of as we'd very much expect to see is that when we leave them without insecticide application, so in the orange, they have much higher BVD symptoms than when we spray them with insecticide. That's nothing new. We also tested the same thing on 2 cultivars that have the RAD2 gene. And you see here there is a big reduction in terms of BVD symptoms. But we still do see symptoms, especially when they're left unsprayed. And then we can look at the cultivars with the RAD2 plus RAD3 genes. And we can see once again, compared to the susceptible cultivar, there is a reduction in BVD symptoms, but they still do get symptoms when unsprayed, and also the symptoms when they're sprayed too. So what does this respond to in terms of the yield impact on the cultivars? So we have the same plot trial, just harvest them, and it's the yield tons per hectare. And we can see here that when we spray the cultivars, these cultivars unsprayed, we suffer a yield penalty, which once again, as we expect to see, and this was around 2 tons per hectare. But in the cultivars with the RAD2 genes, we see a much reduced reduction in yield. In fact, one of the cultivars tested has an increase in yield when left unsprayed. And when we look at the RAD2 plus 3 cultivars, same sort of pattern. We do see a yield reduction when they're left unsprayed, but this is only about 1 ton per hectare, and it's less than the yield penalty we see in response to susceptible cultivars. So overall, we can see a trend that these cultivars suffer a lower yield penalty when they're left unsprayed. So just sort of to sum up the message today, we can show that the BYDV transmission is reduced by ability of aphids to transmit BYDV to cultivars of barley with tolerant genes is reduced. Tolerant cultivars, they maintain a high yield despite showing visible BYDV symptoms in the field, and tolerant cultivars showed reduced yield penalty when left out insecticide compared to your susceptible cultivars. And also interesting work coming forward is that in the plot trial this year, we now have varieties with a resistance gene, which could improve our management of BYDV even further. Awesome. Thanks so much. And just thank to everyone who's helped me on the project. Thank you.
We're now going to go across to Sinead to talk about rye for higher value markets.
This project looked at winter barley, winter rye and spring wheat for non-feed and instead food applications. So today I talk about winter rye. So why consider winter rye for this application? At the moment in Ireland, the crop occupies a small area and for the majority is dedicated to feed and a small amount for distilling. The area in recent years has increased from just under 500 hectares to above 3,700. When we look to the worldwide rye production, we find that up to 30% of the total crop annually enters human food applications. And at country-specific level, if we look to, for example, Germany, this can reach 40%. So as a result of the increase in rye area and the limited markets often experienced in Ireland, we, in Protein I, looked at the potential of the crop for human food. So to do this, field trials were established across 3 years in 2 locations, Carlow and Waterford, comprised of a panel of both hybrid and population varieties. The variety panel comprised of hybrids, both true hybrids and hybrid admixtures, but also population varieties, which are less frequently cultivated here or in Europe. In each season, the trials were early to mid-October sown and managed uniformly at each location. So the overarching aims of the work was to characterise the varieties in terms of agronomic traits, also food quality and nutritional traits. Today I'll focus mainly on quality. And collecting this data allowed us to benchmark against specifications set out in countries with already established rye food markets. So now I will present 3 heat maps, each dedicated to a different quality trait. On the left, you will see a list of varieties comprised of those currently available, some recently, and others, which aren't currently grown here in Ireland. Below, you see a legend with colours ranging from dark to light, corresponding from low to high mean Hagrid falling number values. So Hagrid falling number is one of the quality traits and is an indicator of sprouting damage, and in food applications is a dictator of the performance in end products. So when we look to the performance of these varieties over 3 years in location 1, we see variability denoted by values which range from light in colour to high in colour, so from high to low. And when we also look at location 2, we see variability across locations. The Hagrid falling number in location 1 ranged from 111 to 235, and in location 2 from 108 to 195. Protein is also important in rye for human food applications, and when we look across locations, we see stark variability, ranging from 9.5 to 10.2, and in location 2, from 7.1 to 9.1. So, for example, if we just look at variety Elias, in the case of both Hagrid falling number and protein, we see almost 60-second difference between Hagrid falling numbers and also 2 unit or more difference between proteins. Finally, test weight, which agronomically is important for indicating grain density. In the case of food, is an important indicator of milling yield. So we see stark variability across locations, ranging from the low 60s to the high to mid 70s. So finally, when we take this data to hand and compare it to specifications set out in regions which already grow rye for human food applications, we find that many varieties meet specification at a mean level across locations and years. We can also essentially take specifications from any region. So for example, Germany, which has higher minimum targets than the UK for this product in the case of 120 seconds for Hagberg and 72 for test weight. Only one variety in this scenario, or when targeting this market, met this minimum target. So also of interest, of course, was how these varieties performed in terms of yield. So this box and whisker plot displays the mean yield by variety type across the 3 years. The hybrid varieties are outlined by the orange boxes and the population varieties by the blue. We see in each season the orange boxes are plotted higher than the blue boxes, and the mean yield across all seasons was 1.4 tonnes per hectare. So this was valuable information to have alongside our quality data. So just to conclude, we asked, could rye in Ireland achieve food quality specifications as set out in regions which currently do this? The answer is yes, however, using certain varieties, as outlined, and especially so when we look at UK targets. Some of the varieties which met specification have been recently or are currently grown here, but there were also others which performed well in this regard. So based on this research, taking both quality and yield data, the hybrid varieties produced high grain yields, but also the ability to meet food specification under Irish growing conditions across locations and years. While some population varieties also met specification, they typically produced lower mean yields, as was outlined in the previous slide. So I would like to acknowledge those involved. I'm under the supervision of Dr. Susanna Barrett in Teagasc and Professor Fiona Doohan in UCD. Thank you for listening.
And we'll head straight now to Stephen Kildea, who's going to talk about chocolate spot in beans.
At the outset, I just want to acknowledge the work that Sheila Alves and our student, Jamie Lee Carter, would have put in to initiate this work a number of years ago. Jamie would have presented, I think, on some of her research in 2023. Just to want to highlight that chocolate spot, look, it is a disease of field beans. It is potentially caused by up to 4 different species of botrytis. And there is an importance aspect there because those different species can have different sort of levels of fungicide sensitivity. So that's something that we didn't know, I suppose, in terms of, okay, what have we got from an Irish perspective? In terms of control, look, varietal resistance has a role to play, but unfortunately where we have, I suppose, wet weather conditions, and that is typically, I suppose, where we would grow these beans and a lot of beans, we can suffer a lot from chocolate spot. And unfortunately, the availability or the number of chemistries that are available to be used on beans is actually quite limited. So we actually have to think about, okay, what level of sensitivity might be out there? What is the species that is going to be causing that? Because botrytis itself is probably one of those pathogens or fungal pathogens that is most at risk of fungicide resistance. So from that aspect, a couple of years ago, Jamie did quite a large survey of bean crops, and one of the things that was found that actually from an Irish perspective, chocolate spot has been caused by a single species, Botrytis fabae. So that is actually, even having that information is important so that we can start to think about, okay, the risk to resistance developing. And there was very limited diversity within the collection that she established. But one of the things that we wanted to know is, okay, is there any data available from a resistance perspective? And this was being posed, I suppose, by Ewan posed this question to me because there was this feedback that was coming from the ground that maybe control is a little bit more difficult than we would expect. But remembering that control in general in a bean crop can be difficult. But the only reported resistance that is available across the EPO region, based on what is in the EPO database, is actually to MBC fungicides and iprodione, which are not used or haven't been used for quite some time on beans. So that did pose the question, okay, what might exist from a perspective of this Botrytis fabae? So the first thing to do is to look at, okay, what do we know about Botrytis cinerea? That is, I suppose, the model species. It isn't what's in Irish bean crops, but it is very, very closely related. And if we look at that from I suppose a European or even a global context, we see that QOI resistance is very prevalent in botrytis, be it in strawberries or grapes, but also the SDHIs. There's quite a range of mutations that can arise for SDHIs. And although the azoles are not really used typically for botrytis control in those crops, there are also some mutations emerging. So we took the collection that Jamie had established, and we took a random 46 isolates from that collection, and we screened that molecularly for those mutations. And unfortunately, we are finding some of those. So we are finding the G143A that we know would be, I suppose, an issue from a QOI or a strobilurine perspective. That is in about 59, just under 60% of those strains that we looked at. We also found some of the mutations exactly the same that would be in botrytis cinerea in Fab in that collection at a high proportion. We also, in 100% of those isolates, we found a mutation of the azoles, but we don't know what that means from an impact perspective because it's all isolates were there. But equally, it's not detected in any cinerea that from a global correction. So that does lead us to say, okay, what does that sensitivity look like? So taking a small number of those isolates, brought them into the lab and did some basic fungicide sensitivity work. So this is our untreated, taking those three groups so that we would have wild type, no mutations. We have an SDHI mutation, H272R. And then we have that combination of the G143A and the SDHI mutation. Sensitivity-wise, we don't see any difference there in the growth of the fungus, so they're all looking the same. When we actually look with proline, which is available for control of chocolate spot in the lattice era, we do see that actually there's no real difference between the three of those groups. As I say, we don't know whether that mutation that we find impacts sensitivity, but comparing it with botrytis cinerea that we had in the mix that doesn't have the mutation, it doesn't appear to have that impact, which is a positive finding in itself. When we looked at salatinol, one of the SDHIs, we didn't see a huge difference between the sensitive or the strain that doesn't have the mutation and that does. But there is still some small growth, as you can see in the assay itself. We have to look at this further and we have to expand the range of SDHIs that we are looking at. But we also looked at the signum, which is a QOI and SDHI. We can see that actually in the sensitive proportion of the population, it is a very effective fungicide. And it supposes the standard bearer in terms of chocolate spot control. We can see that actually where we have the SDHI mutation, we are getting very, very good control of that because the QOI in that mix is doing a very effective job. Where we have that QOI and SDHI resistance, we can see that there is some good growth there. It is reduced relative to the untreated, so it is having some impact, but you can see that there is an impact of resistance all the same. When we look at the strob then, you can see that actually the wild type growth there's a small amount of growth, but that's what we'd be expecting from that sort of scenario. You can see where we don't have the G143A and a large proportion, remember, is still sensitive to that. You can see that again, it's similar to the wild type, but where we have that G143A, you can see that actually the growth is impacted, or control is impacted there. So we do have to take all this information and say, okay, how can we now build upon that and make sure that we're managing control of chocolate spot? And the first thing I would say is that it is a disease that can get into epidemic proportions. It's a build-up of that inoculum. And what we want to do is try and, it's critical to make sure that you're preventing the epidemic from getting into that sort of a stage where it is very difficult to control. And that comes back down to timing, making sure that you're getting that timing on as close as possible that is right. As I say, ensuring canopy coverage. Look, of course, beans will get to a point where actually running through it with a fungicide, you're not going to be able to get that canopy coverage. So if you are applying it, you have to think about that equally, making sure that you're getting that protection on. And it is, I would say, it's critical that we're thinking about the use of these products from a protective perspective. We want to mix as modes of action as much as we feasibly can. And remember that there is a limitation of products that are available or registered that may be products, but actually we need to be looking at the modes of action. What's in there? QOI, SDHI, azole, etc. They need to be mixed and to be protected as much as possible. And you could see that in the previous slide where we had SDHI resistance but no strob resistance, we were getting very effective control of those strains. If we can alternate the modes of action, even better, in terms of that if you are using two applications, not to be using the same product or the same modes of action, I should emphasize, every time. And equally, not to forget that, okay, although chocolate spot is an issue, equally in certain seasons, rust may also be a bigger issue. And the fungicides that we are applying, those QOIs, SDHIs, will be effective against rust. Thank you very much.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Jack, Sinead and Stephen for presenting at the conference. All of the conference presentations are available on the Teagasc website, and the link is in the show notes. Teagasc are now more than halfway through their programme of local tillage seminars, which are currently taking place across the country. The remaining seminars will be held in Offaly on February the 10th and Donegal on February the 19th. Each seminar will focus on topics of particular interest to farmers in that region. Teagasc are also hosting the first outdoor crop walks of the season, focusing on early season management of winter crops. The first event will take place in Teagasc Oak Park, Carlow, next Tuesday at 2 p.m. Further events are also scheduled to take place in Cork, Kilkenny and Wexford next week, with events in the northeast taking place the following week. For further details on all of these events in your area, please go to teagasc.ie/events. So finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.